Hi, and welcome to this video from SQL Server 2012 tutorial.com. Today our topic is how to implement security in the newest edition of SQL Server. So let us get going with this topic. As you know, security is a huge topic in SQL Server along with other databases. This has to do obviously with more and more computing done using databases and more people trying to hack into corporate data. So as far as security, talking about in terms of SQL Server, there are many layers of security. The first one is obviously physical security, which means limiting access to the actual database server and also the network. You could do this by closing choosing a firewall and closing the ports. Also, specifically for SQL Server, you should always close the default port, which is 1433, and also limit remote access to the server. Moving on, the next point is OS security, which is the operating system. So this means you should be using a secure OS with all the applicable service packs applied. You should restrict server logins and also minimize the use of local admin rights. In addition, you should be limiting access to SQL files, and we will look at those in a separate video tutorial, but basically things like the data file and the log files, those should be definitely in a secure location. Moving on, the next idea is surface area, which basically means all the different points or points of entry really into SQL Server. After 2005, a lot of these services are turned off by default. Prior to that, SQL 2000 and before, it was essentially these services were available, and now there's less of a surface area, I guess, in terms of that. Also for SQL services like the database engine, SQL agent, you should always be using a domain account with low privileges. You should never really be using a local admin account or one of those other settings. So that's a recommendation, best practice recommendation. Regarding file folder security, you should definitely be implementing that, especially for the program files, the data files, and also the backup files. Imagine if somebody steals your database from your company, especially the backup file, they could essentially recover and restore the database, which is not what you want to happen on a Monday morning. Also, you need to have a better basically collection of users into a role, which is the same as a group in Windows. You should be using encryption and certificates for sensitive data, and another huge topic is monitoring and auditing security on an ongoing basis. You could use tools like DB Protect. And finally, you should have a security policy in place. What that means is who will have access to SQL Server, what kind of permissions, what kind of groups are you creating. So have that in place for your environment. So moving on, as for security terminology, there are lots of different items in here. So let's go down the list. The first is known as a principal. This is really an entity that can request SQL Server resources. Okay, it can be at the server level or at the database level, and this can include things like server logins and database users. And we will also look at other items related to this. You can also have what's known as a role, and like I just mentioned in the earlier slide, a role in SQL Server is really equivalent to a group in Windows. Okay, the idea is to have a collection of principals for ease of management and administration. Well, what does that mean? So imagine that you have a bunch of database users that are in the sales group. Okay, instead of assigning permissions or access to the individual user, what you do is you put all of those users into a sales group, assign the group permissions, and this way you can easily manage them as the new users come in. you just add them to the group, and as you know, some people leave, you just take them out. This is the preferred way of management, not only for SQL Server but also for a Windows environment. Moving on, the next topic is schema, which is something that SQL Server has been using since 2005. It really is a container of database objects, okay, like tables, views, etc. So the idea is that the objects are owned by schema and not database users. And so once again, as the users come and go, your schema should stay intact. Moving on, the next important term is securable. These are really the bottom line resources that can be accessed. So you could have a scope at the server level, database level, or a schema scope, okay? So things that include securables are login, user, a database, table, view, and procedures. And then finally we have permissions. Access to any securable is managed by permissions. These are granted to a principal like a database user. So quite a few terms there. I basically, in order to get more into this, I have a couple of these links that I am going to place up here, so you can definitely visit them. These pages definitely talk more about the terms that we are talking about. So here, when you're talking about securables, see, you could have at the server level, you could have a login, whereas at the database level, you could have a user, and then also securables under the schema. So definitely visit this site. The next one is a picture from MSDN, which is the Microsoft Development Network. Let me do this in here. And so if you go to this one, this is a picture that I've also used in the prior versions, but basically it kind of breaks down the different terms. Okay, so when you're talking about principals, you are talking about if it's at the Windows level, this could be a login. At the SQL Server level, it could be a SQL Server login or a role, and then you have some principals at the database level. So these are all the different items that will have access to SQL Server. Well, on the flip side, you have securables, and securables are just about anything in SQL Server. It could be a login, it could be a database. Within the database, you are going to have things like schemas, tables, views, functions, procedures, and then you know, the list goes on and on. Obviously, these securables can have, you know, things at a lower level like columns and whatnot. So I do like this picture that explains a little bit more visually what we're trying to tell you, and here is the link that I have included in here. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of these terms. Okay, so as far as principals, it really is an entity that can request a SQL Server resource. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, this can be at the server level, or it can also be at the database level. Now, when you're talking about the server level, you can really have two levels. You can have at the Windows level or a SQL Server level. And then this has to do with authentication. Essentially, you know, when you are trying to give access to principals, give access to SQL Server to these principals. Now, the Windows can be either a local login or a domain login, which is domain is the preferred way to do it. And then as for a SQL Server, it is always a SQL login. Best practice is to use a Windows level principal only, but that may not work out every time. You know, there are companies that run different operating systems, so maybe you have a Apple OS or Unix environment. In that case, you have no choice but to use a SQL login, but it is preferred to definitely use Windows level principals. Now, as far as what we have talked about so far has been at the server level. Now, moving on to the database level, you can have things like a database user, a database role, and also an application role. So I think enough discussion on this. Let us jump to some hands-on exercises. So what we're going to do is, and I will walk you through this, we are going to create a server login and then a database user. And here is the script. So let me Launch Management Studio, and I am running SQL Server 2012.